In this video, we will be starting to look at a few more watercolor techniques. Some things that you will need are your paint, your watercolor technique sheet, a cup of water, some paint brushes, your palette for mixing, a little sponge. This is cut from a bigger sponge. And a paper clip or something that's sharp that you can use to scrape. Alright, so one of the first ones that we need to start with, and we'll keep coming back to, is called overlay. So I'm going to label this section overlay. What overlay really is putting a color down, a light color, letting it dry, then putting a little bit darker color down, letting it dry, and putting another darker color. So you're laying over the colors to get the effect of like shading and darker values. So I'm going to start with my overlay by taking some yellow. And just filling my whole entire blob with my yellow. Alright, so that's my first layer, and I'm really just going to let that dry, and we will come back to it. Alright, so we're going to move on to a different one. The next one is really kind of going to be two in one. It's going to be a wash. And we're going to start out with a wash, but then we're also going to add scratching. So I'm going to rotate my paper and write scratching over here. Right, a wash is really just a thin layer, and it's really taking a thin color and painting it like all the way across. So it doesn't do anything fancy. Really, it's just like tinting your paper a certain color. So I'm going to take a green, and that is way too dark for a green wash. It really needs to be lighter. So I'm going to take and water it down. So I'm going to test my color and see exactly what it looks like on another piece of paper. So it should be very light. You should be able to see a lot of paper through it. It shouldn't be dark. So I'm going to take my very light watered down green, and I'm going to paint my entire area green. That's a wash. Now something fancy you can do with a wash is you can take something that's sharp, kind of scratch, something that you can scratch. Alright, so I scratched the paper. Now I'm going to take my green again and I'm going to go over it. Let's see if it works. It might be that my color's a little bit too watered down. Typically when you scratch the surface, it'll get a little bit darker in that area. And take a little bit darker, so now you can see a little bit of the scratch marks. Now this works better with watercolor paper. Some areas it just kind of tore. I think once it starts drying we might be able to see the scratch marks a little bit better, so we'll come back to that. Okay, so that's a wash and scratching. This can often be used for grass, or if you're wanting like kind of fur texture, but you can't necessarily get that with a paintbrush, you can scratch the surface to get those little like fine hairlines. Alright, the next one that I want to do is sponging. So sponging sounds like sponge, and that's really kind of what we're going to be doing. So I have a little piece of sponge, and this is really, really hard. Like I can't necessarily do much with this. So that means that I need to soften it up. So I'm going to just dunk it in my cup of water and wring it out a little bit. You want it to be like damp, but you don't want it to be like soaking with water. All right, so now it's a lot smushier and I can manipulate it a little bit better. I'm actually going to take and put this directly into my paint. So I have a little bit, you can see the paint on there. Now I'm going to just gently press on one side with my sponge. Now that's like a nice texture. Now if you want less texture, you can press a little bit harder and see what happens. And you can layer different colors. So this is more pressure over here, less pressure. This is really good for textured backgrounds. Anything that has texture that you're painting, this is a good way of creating it. I'm rinsing out my sponge now. I'm not going to leave it all dirty for the next person. Okay, so the next one I want to do is similar to sponging, but kind of in an opposite way. So I'm going to get a paper towel. Here I have a paper towel. And this is actually a fairly large paper towel, and we have a very small area, so it's possible we need to rip our paper towel so it's a little bit smaller and more manageable. So the next one we're going to do is called blotting. So with blotting, I'm first going to wet the paper. So I'm going to just take my brush and I'm just painting on water. I'm going to take a color. I like to do blue for this one. I'm going to mix it in my palette because my blue is awfully thick and sticky in that. Alright, so here I have mixed kind of a watery blue. And I'm going to paint that in my already wet blob. So with blotting, we're going to take a paper towel and we're going to lift it up. So with this one, you kind of get a cloud effect. This actually works so much better on watercolor paper, I will tell you. Regular drawing paper, the paint like absorbs differently. Watercolor paper, it kind of repels it a little bit. So this is usually good for clouds, so you can pull it up so then it's not all blue. I'm going to re-wet it and try to pull it up again. Perhaps I didn't work quite as fast as I needed to on that one. Sometimes you have to work pretty fast for them to not absorb into the drawing paper. Alright, so the next one I'm going to do is called Wet on Wet. Alright, so with Wet on Wet, just like we did blotting, we are going to wet the paper first. But I'm also going to want to get some colors ready. I like to use colors that are next to each other on the color wheel because they blend nicely together. So I'm going to get some red ready. I have some blue, which I'll probably use. And I'm also going to get some purple. So those are nice analogous colors. Alright, next I'm going to wet my paper. And I'm being very generous with the amount of water that I'm using. Alright, so now I can use my paint that's pretty watery, and I can apply it to the wet paper. So what you're going to see is the water kind of taking the paint and almost marbleizing it. If it's not swirling around, that means you probably didn't put enough water on the surface of your paper. So then you need to just apply more water. That is wet on wet. Wet on wet is good for kind of abstract backgrounds. Now as this starts to dry, it probably will change. This works better on watercolor paper. Drawing paper has a tendency to like kind of curl, and you'll have places where it'll sink in and it won't dry flat. But it still looks pretty cool. Alright, so the next one, we're gonna kind of do two things in one. And I really like to just take and split one of my spots in half for this one. I like to have it so you can see the difference. So one of them is going to be dry on dry. Another term for a dry on dry is also dry brushing. And the other one is going to be dry on wet. So we're going to see what those differences are. I'm going to keep my paper a little bit like that. Alright, so we're going to try dry brushing first. I'm going to take, and most of my colors are already kind of pretty moist. And I have been using them quite a bit. So the paint isn't really dry. And so that makes dry brushing a little bit tricky. So we're going to use paper towels as an assist. So I'm going to use, I haven't used my brown very much, so I'm going to use brown, but I'm still going to use my paper towel. So here's my brown. I'm going to dry my brush off a little bit with my paper towel. So what dry brushing is it's great for fur or texture. So I'm just going to draw kind of what I think fur should look like. And you can see kind of individual brush strokes. It's very textured. So that's dry brushing. Great for texture, great for fur, anything like that. Now the other one is dry on wet. So we're going to do the dry brushing, but we first have to wet our paper. Let's see what the difference is between these. So I'm going to take just a little bit of water and brush that on. I'm not going to over wet it like I did with the wet on wet. I'm just getting it a little bit wet. Alright, so now I'm going to do my dry brushing. So I'm going to get some paint on my brush. I'm going to dry it off a little bit or wipe it off a little bit. And then I'm going to make those fur marks again. So what you're going to notice is this way softens up some of those marks. It's not nearly as harsh as the other. So they're starting to kind of blur out a little bit. So depending on what kind of fur texture you want or what kind of texture you want, this is a softer version of that. Okay, we're going to revisit our overlay. So by now, my first layer of my overlay is dry. So that means that I can start preparing and putting on my second layer. Now you can go in two directions as far as yellow goes. You could go darker this way. I'm going to actually go darker this way. So I'm going to go with my green. I have some green in here, but it's pretty watered down, so I'm going to add a little bit more paint to it. Alright, so what I want to do is create the illusion of some shading. So I'm going to make this look like the sides are a little bit darker, almost like this is like a weird rock or something. Now I have a lot of paint on my brush and I feel like it's a little bit overloaded. So I'm going to brush that off and just reload. So now I feel like I have a little more control. So right on top of my yellow, I'm going to put some green. Now I'm not covering the whole area. I'm just going to put some green around the edges and make it look like kind of like an illusion of an edge. Then I'm going to rinse my brush off, dab a little bit of the extra water off, and I'm going to graduate that out, meaning I'm going to blend it out. Alright, so there's my first layer of overlay, or I guess my second layer, but first overlay. So the next thing I'm going to do after this dries is I'm going to come with another darker color. Now I could do blue or I could skip to purple, which I think is what I'm going to do. Okay, but it is currently a little bit too wet for me to do that. Alright, so for my next layer, it's still a little wet, but I'm still going to do it. I'm going to put a purple. Now I'm not going to cover my entire green. I'm just putting it kind of on the edge. Notice how that purple doesn't really look purple whenever you put it over the green. It looks a little bit darker, but it's definitely not looking very purple. Now I'm going to use a little bit of water in my brush and I'm going to graduate that out. So layering colors over each other can create this illusion. It can create different colors, but it also can create the illusion of shading. In the next video, we will do some more where we're looking at additives and other materials that we can add to our watercolor to make different effects.